Hi folks, in this video we switched to discussing logic and human cognition. When we've been looking at formal models in this class, we've been using that in order to understand how reasoning works, but it's also the case that humans don't sometimes diverge from proper reasoning. We often reason invalidly, and so an interesting area of study is looking at the empirical work on how we actually reason in our everyday lives, especially when we deviate from what logic or rationality would require of us. In order to study this, there's a really important distinction that we have to make and some terminology you have to understand. And that's the difference between personal level concepts and subpersonal level concepts. When I talk about you as a person, or when I talk about the personal level, it's things that we could attribute to you. Like if I asked what you believe about a certain matter, or what did you eat for breakfast, for example, those are personal level categories. When you can use the first person pronoun I to state something, then that thing is personal level. But there's also parts of you. You're like this complex machine or complex organism that has all of these subsystems and subparts. And when we talk about some of those parts, that's not necessarily the same thing as talking about you. Or when you refer to those parts of yourself, that's not necessarily the same thing as what you would refer to with the name I or the pronoun I. For example, you wouldn't say, what did my stomach eat for breakfast? Or what does my neuron, what does my neuron think about my breakfast? To talk about thinking or believing things is like a category mistake. You have neurons in your brain, and those encode or carry information, but we wouldn't say that your neuron believes things, or my neuron knows this. You, the person, knows that because a subsystem of you carries that information. So when we talk about like regions of your brain in the empirical study of human cognition, or what kind of processes certain modules in your brain are doing, those are subpersonal concepts. And what those subpersonal systems do is they realize personal level facts. So you remember what you had for breakfast, you the person do so, only because some subpersonal system of you, like some collection of neurons, some cluster of neurons, encodes certain information about what you had for breakfast. And we can talk about both of these things at the same time. They're not in competition with each other. The subpersonal facts are what realize or what make it possible, what make it the case that you at the personal level remember what you ate for breakfast. This distinction is important. For one thing, it's different. Subpersonal is not the same thing as subconscious, because oftentimes subconscious things are personal level ones that you just don't have introspective awareness of. Like, you know, some silly Freudian example, like you have subconscious hatred of your friend, but you are repressing it. Then that hatred is a personal level thing. It's not like some neurons hate your friend. It's a personal level thing, but you have repressed it away from conscious awareness. Subpersonal is not the same thing. These are parts of you which are incorrect to refer to as you as an individual. There are only subparts of you that we could correctly refer to them. So subpersonal is not identical to subconscious. This is all important because logic applies to human cognition at both levels, but it's key to not confuse them, because you could easily think there's mass confusion here if you didn't separate these ideas. Basically, your brain works as a computing device, and it carries information the exact same way a computer could carry information. And we already saw how the study of logic in this class relates to how information is literally processed in hardware. Well, your brain is like biological hardware, and it's doing processing too. So we can apply logic to asking, how does information transmit or transfer between neurons? And how does the literal biology of this human computational device work? That would be applying logic at a sort of neurobiological level. That would all be subpersonal information, just like when we talk about the processor in your computer and how memory is stored in different parts of the computer and whatnot. So that's one whole application. I'm going to bracket that, but that's something that's really cool, and really important research is being done on that these days, obviously. I'm also going to talk about, in this video, focus on the personal level. And we can ask, sort of, when we reason in our everyday lives, this is the sense in which formal logic provides a kind of model for when we're reasoning validly or invalidly, or soundly or unsoundly. And oftentimes it's a really important fact about psychology that cognitive psychology has uncovered, that we often make logical errors. And so it's really cool to study, when does this happen? How can we possibly correct for it? And this is a really fascinating application of logic to the empirical study of human cognition. And this branch of knowledge is sometimes called cognitive science in general. And it's really an interdisciplinary study between many different social sciences. So Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize as an economist for basically being a cognitive scientist and doing work in this. And if you're interested in learning more about this, there's a popular book called Thinking Fast and Slow that Kahneman published that's quite accessible and examines some of this stuff in more detail. What I'm going to do now is give you a little demonstration about how this goes so you can be convinced that we sometimes make logical errors. I normally do this when I'm teaching this class live as an in-person activity because it's very fun and it's surprising and arresting when you see it shown to you. Well, I'll just describe how it goes and then I'll give you some data from some time that I've run this in the past. What we do is we split the class into two different groups so that we can get two different conditions for our terribly unscientific study here. And I'll just tell you how things go. You don't have, well, you can play along if you want. Let's play along. This will be more fun. So this is your question. Let's assume you're all in group A. And I tell you this. Here's your question. Did Gandhi live to be 38 years or older? So when Gandhi died, was he over 38 or not? And this is just a yes or no question. Make your mind up now. And of course, don't Google it. This is, the whole point is that you're in like a psychology lab and you're supposed to be testing what you really think. It's based on your actual cognition. So it'd be ridiculous to look this up. Okay, hopefully you answered yes or no. Now let's keep going. Now what I want you to do, question 2, I want you to decide on the exact age. If you had to make your best guess, what if a lot of money were riding on this and I was going to give you $1,000 if you guessed right? What if I was going to give you $1 million? I don't know, whatever you want. Enough motivation for you. What would you put as your best possible guess? Of course, I mean, and you're not allowed to cheat. Still, that's not the point. I'm not going to actually give you money, so don't look it up. Okay, now I assume you had enough time to make your best guess. Now, this is not a new question. Just whatever that number was, fit it into one of these categories. Which of these does it fit into? I guess there's sort of an overlap here. So maybe treat 60, if you said 60, round down. So 55 to 60 is inclusive, and this would be above 60 to 65. Think of it that way. So if you made one on these borders, then always round down. What I say is how we're going to do it. Okay. Last time I ran this, by the way, you can see where you fit in. The class distributed roughly like this. This is about 150 people in this condition, and then 150 people in the other. Okay, so let's say you're done. You were all in group A. Now, group A wouldn't be allowed to watch what happens with group B, but it really doesn't matter. The key is group B didn't know what happened with group A. Here's the question that group B gets. Instead of 38, I ask you, was Gandhi older or younger than 118? And then again, you just answer yes or no. So identical question, except a different number inserted here. And then again, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to come up with your best possible guess, and then you fit it into this. And then again, you round down so we're computing these things the same. But here's the fascinating thing. When I ask group B this question, again, 150 students, so we're talking about an N sample size of 300 people, this is what the data look like roughly. And so if you put these side by side, it's absolutely striking. This is an incredibly robust result. There's a statistically significant difference between how people respond to these questions. But there was only this difference between my original question. I said 38 here and I said 118 here. Of course, the actual answer is 78. So this interval was chosen so that neither one was closer or was a better indication than the actual answer. They're both 40 years apart from the actual answer. And so this is the funny thing. Nobody thinks Gandhi was under 38 or over 118. And so this number ought not have given you any clue whatsoever. It should have been irrelevant. And yet, because you sort of were given some number beforehand, it creates a kind of influence on you that is almost impossible for human cognizers to ignore. You don't realize that you're so manipulated by whatever number I happen to give you first, but we genuinely are. And the phenomenon in cognitive science for this is called anchoring. It's basically when there's some initial information or a stimulus, and it influences your later inferences and how you make logical judgments. And you oftentimes have no idea it's happening. And this is the funny thing. In this case, you might think that what the questioner asked you, the original number, is not totally irrelevant, because maybe they're trying to give you some indication that he was young or that he was old. And so maybe this isn't the perfect example of anchoring, but the interesting fact is there's all sorts of ways in which anchoring has been demonstrated in the empirical studies, where it has no possible beneficial information that could be conveyed by the question. Like people make you look at a totally random number that you know is just a totally random number, and then that subliminally or influences your later judgments. And so this is just one of the many ways in which we are influenced by context, which we can admit ourselves is totally irrational, has no bearing or ought to have no bearing on what our later judgments are. So anchoring is just one of these examples. Based on all of this study about human, and this is called the heuristics and biases literature, the sort of literature and ways in which human actual judgments are prone to many different forms of biases. There's various empirical models for how human reasoning actually works, and I'm going to just describe one of them to you. There's a whole lot of complexity here, but this actually has a big impact on how you should think about logic and the use of logic in your everyday lives. The models that I'm talking about are called dual process models because they posit two different systems of information processing. The type, sometimes it's called type 1 or system 1. The various terminology, these are sort of synonyms in contemporary literature, even though there's lots of different versions of these kinds of theories. Type 1 and system 1, this is processing that you can do very fast, and you can do multiple versions of it at the exact same time. So that's why it's called parallel processing, because I can process information, many different bits of information like this at the same time. And whereas type 2, system 2 processing it takes way more energy and attention, and so I can only do one sort of computation of this type at a time. Let me give you sort of an example. When your brain automatically processes information, like if you look at an easy formal proof and you automatically see how to do it, then your brain, in a sense, handed you that information. Some system 1 processing occurred in your brain, which gave you the information, and it took into consideration all sorts of stuff. All the different premises to the argument maybe, and all the different intermediary steps, and you knew that you could do the proof. Contrast that with if you look at a really hard formal proof and you don't know how to solve it, and then you start trying out strategies. You wonder like, okay, would a reductio work here? And then you follow through that processing. What you're doing there is you're doing type 2 or system 2 processing, where you're actually using a lot of cognitive resources to focus your attention on some particular problem. It's just like when you look at a math problem and it's really easy, like 7 times 7, and you know the answer immediately. That's type 1, that's system 1. But if I give you a long math problem that you have to compute with a pen and paper, like 243 times 79, then you have to, the process of solving that requires system 2 or type 2 processing. And this is one of the interesting connections to the heuristics and biases literature. Our system 1 responses are very easily exploited, for example, by anchoring. So when I asked you to make a guess at Gandhi's age, you probably didn't break out a piece of pen and paper and start making all sorts of computations and running equations. You probably just weighed things in your head. Maybe your brain automatically took into consideration everything you knew. Like maybe you saw the movie Gandhi dozens of years ago and you're trying to estimate how old do you think that actor was in that movie, or you've seen pictures of Gandhi. Your brain took into consideration all the information you had about Gandhi and spat out a number to you. That was basically a system 1 kind of response. And the trouble is our system 1 is very easily manipulated. Lots of our biases have to do with rushing to system 1 sorts of judgments. And so if you want to start improving your logic and reasoning in your everyday life, one essential thing to understand is this difference and the types of logical errors you might make in type 1 processing versus the type of logical errors you might make in system 2 processing. And just understanding that distinction and that you need different strategies in each case is really important. And it's going to help you improve as a cognizer. Okay, I've talked a lot in this video. I'll talk more about this exact same topic and try to give you some concrete examples in the next video. Thanks.